If you hear this message, leave. Tartarus is not for humans. It's alive, and he wants us. Dust is getting everywhere. It's already in the air. It's already in us.
Accept us. This is bigger than you. This is your destiny.
We are eternal.
The transport shuttle shuddered violently as it pierced through the dense atmosphere of Tartarus. Dr. Caleb Rains gripped the armrests of his seat, his breath shallow beneath the tight seal of his breathing mask. The cockpit windows revealed nothing but a swirling expanse of red, dust and debris whipped into a frenzy by the planet's unrelenting storms. The pilot, an older man with deep creases around his eyes, muttered a curse under his breath. "Welcome to hell," he said, his voice crackling through the intercom. "Echelon 9's just ahead, if the winds don't kill us first." Caleb clenched his jaw and focused on the rhythmic hiss of his mask. He'd read the mission brief a dozen times during the 6-month journey. A remote colony struggling to survive on an unwelcoming world. What the brief hadn't captured was the suffocating sense of dread that seemed to permeate the very air. The shuttle landed with a jarring thud, its hull groaning under the force of the storm. As the ramp descended, Caleb was hit with a wave of heat and the stinging tang of iron. The dust was everywhere, clinging to his visor, his suit, and even the seams of his boots. A small group of colonists waited at the edge of the landing pad, their figures silhouetted against the dim glow of the colony's dome lights. They wore rebreathers and heavy, dust-covered clothing that obscured most of their features. "Dr. Rains," a woman called, stepping forward. Her voice was muffled and her tone was clipped, almost perfunctory. "I'm Rhea, the colony's chief engineer. Welcome to Tartarus." Caleb nodded, shaking her gloved hand. Her grip was firm but brief, her eyes scanning him with a mixture of suspicion and weariness. The other colonists offered little more than a passing glance before retreating to the safety of the dome. Inside, the colony was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The airlock hissed shut behind them, sealing out the storm, and the artificial atmosphere felt almost too clean. The corridors were narrow and utilitarian, lit by flickering overhead panels that cast sharp shadows on the metal walls. Everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and machine oil. Rhea led Caleb to his quarters, her pace brisk. "You'll find the colony's records in the main archive, medical bays down the east wing. If you're hungry, the mess hall serves 3 times a day, but don't expect much variety. Supplies are tight." "Any immediate medical concerns I should know about?" Caleb asked, falling into step beside her. She hesitated. "A few cases of respiratory issues, some skin conditions. Nothing we haven't seen before." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying a note of unease. "But you'll see for yourself soon enough." Caleb wanted to press her, but they had arrived at his quarters. The room was small, barely enough space for a cot, a desk, and a storage unit. A layer of red dust clung stubbornly to the vents and corners, despite the air filtration system humming softly overhead. "Rest up," Rhea said. "You'll need it." She left without another word, the door hissing shut behind her. Caleb dropped his duffel bag onto the cot and sat down heavily. The journey had been long, but exhaustion eluded him. He stared at the wall, listening to the faint hum of machinery and the occasional creak of the colony's metal frame. Something about this place felt off, a tension that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. The next morning, Caleb began his rounds. The colonists were polite but distant, their answers clipped and their expressions guarded. Many wore gloves and long sleeves, even in the climate-controlled dome. It wasn't long before Caleb noticed the patterns. Rashes that looked more like scales, persistent coughing fits that left streaks of blood on tissues, and eyes that seemed to stare just a little too long. He spent hours in the medical bay combing through the colony's health records. They were incomplete, with large gaps in data and entire cases missing. What little he did find was disturbing. High rates of respiratory illness, unexplained weight loss, and a series of disappearances over the past year. That night, as he lay in bed, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the colony was hiding something. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. He woke suddenly in the middle of the night, his heart racing. The faint glow of his desk lamp revealed a fine layer of red dust covering his desk, his floor, even the sheets of his bed. He wiped it away with trembling hands, only for it to cling stubbornly to his fingers. The next morning, he confronted Rhea about the disappearances. She was evasive, her answers carefully measured. "People leave," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Tartarus isn't for everyone." Caleb didn't believe her, but he didn't press further. Not yet. As the days passed, the storm outside grew worse, and the tension inside the colony reached a breaking point. The dust seemed to find its way into every corner, despite the filtration systems working overtime. Colonists whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously toward the windows. And always there was that faint, metallic tang in the air, as if the planet itself were watching, waiting. Caleb had come to Tartarus to save lives, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd walked into something far beyond his understanding, and that the planet had no intention of letting him leave. The storm hadn't let up in days. Its relentless howl reverberated through the metal walls of the colony, a ceaseless reminder of the planet's hostility. Inside the cramped quarters of Echelon 9, tensions simmered like a boiling pot, and the news of Joran's disappearance only turned the heat up further. Caleb first heard about it from a group of colonists in the mess hall. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. "He just walked out," one man muttered, glancing nervously toward the door. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he gripped a mug of lukewarm nutrient broth. "Left his rover behind. Didn't even take his oxygen reserves." "That's not the first time either," a woman whispered. "You remember Lewis? Or Hannah? They all started acting strange before they left." Caleb leaned closer. "What do you mean, acting strange?" The group fell silent, their eyes darting around the room. Finally, the woman spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Like they weren't themselves, staring out at the storm, muttering to themselves, and then one day, gone. Rhea interrupted before Caleb could press further. "Doctor, Her tone was sharp, her expression unreadable. "A word, please." She led him out of the mess hall and into the corridor, where the walls seemed to press in tighter than usual. "Don't get involved," she said, her voice low. "Joran's gone, just like the others. There's nothing you can do." "Gone?" Caleb echoed, his frustration mounting. "What does that even mean, Rhea? People don't just vanish. And what about the records? Every case I've looked into is incomplete or missing entirely." Rhea sighed, rubbing her temples. For the first time, Caleb noticed the faint discoloration on her hands, small patches of skin that shimmered faintly under the artificial light. "I don't have time for your theories, Doctor. My job is to keep this colony running. Yours is to keep people breathing. Stick to that." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Caleb seething. He returned to his quarters, determined to find answers on his own. That night, he couldn't sleep. The storm's howling seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if calling to him. The red dust had crept into the cracks of the window sill, forming thin, web-like patterns on the glass. By morning, Caleb's frustration had given way to determination. If no one else would investigate Joran's disappearance, he would. He requisitioned a rover and set out toward the coordinates of the last known signal from Joran's vehicle, just beyond the main ridge to the north. The storm was unforgiving, battering the rover with winds strong enough to rattle its frame. Caleb's breathing mask fogged with condensation as he navigated the treacherous terrain, the vehicle's sensors struggling to pierce through the swirling dust. Finally, the faint outline of Joran's rover came into view, half buried in a dune. Caleb parked and stepped out, the storm clawing at his suit as he approached. The rover's door was open, its interior coated in a fine layer of red dust. Inside, he found signs of a struggle, deep gouges in the dashboard as if made by fingernails, and a streak of blood leading out into the storm. The sight sent a chill down his spine. Nearby, something caught his eye, a faint glow emanating from a crevice in the ground. As he moved closer, he saw it. A pulsating, organic growth embedded in the rocky soil. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, its surface glistening with a mucus-like sheen. Tendrils extended from its core, curling and uncurling as if tasting the air. Caleb crouched down, his gloved hand trembling as he reached for a sample vial. The growth seemed to react to his presence, its tendrils twitching faster. He managed to collect a small piece, sealing it in the vial before retreating to the safety of the rover. Back at the colony, Caleb went straight to the medical bay, where he spent hours analyzing the sample under the microscope. The results were both fascinating and horrifying. The organism wasn't just alive, it was invasive. Its cells bonded with human tissue, altering it at a molecular level. It wasn't merely parasitic, it was transformative. Caleb's findings left him shaken, but they raised more questions than answers. What was this organism? How had it come to Tartarus? And most pressing of all, how many colonists were already infected? The next morning, Caleb called a meeting with the colony's leadership. He presented his findings, but his words were met with skepticism and outright hostility. "This is speculation," one of the council members snapped. "We have enough problems without you spreading panic." "It's not speculation," Caleb insisted, holding up the vial. This organism is in the dust. It's in the air we breathe, the water we drink. It's changing us. Rhea stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but Caleb could see the tension in her jaw. "Even if you're right," she said finally, "what do you propose we do? We can't leave. Tartarus is all we have." Caleb had no answer. The truth was, he didn't know how to fight something so pervasive, so insidious. All he knew was that the colony was running out of time. That night, as the storm continued its relentless assault, another colonist disappeared. And for the first time, Caleb felt the dust beneath his skin, whispering to him in a voice he couldn't understand. The storm didn't ease, and neither did the whispers. They came at first only in Caleb's dreams, subtle and fragmented, like echoes bouncing off the jagged walls of his subconscious. Words he couldn't place, sounds he couldn't identify. But as the days dragged on, the whispers grew louder, insistent, creeping into his waking moments like a distant hum that refused to fade. The colony, meanwhile, was coming apart at the seams. Joran's disappearance had shaken everyone, but it was the subsequent vanishing of 2 more colonists that tipped the delicate balance into chaos. People stopped showing up for work shifts, muttering about the futility of it all. Some locked themselves in their quarters, others wandered the corridors aimlessly, their eyes vacant. And everywhere the red dust lingered, clinging to every surface, seeping through cracks no matter how often it was cleaned. Caleb spent most of his time in the lab, obsessing over the sample he'd collected from the growth near Joran's rover. The organism was unlike anything he'd encountered. It replicated rapidly, integrating itself into other cells with disturbing ease. Under the microscope, he watched as human tissue samples, taken from the medical bay's reserves, succumbed to the parasite, the cells twisting and morphing into something unrecognizable. He began to suspect that the organism wasn't just consuming its hosts, it was remaking them. His own body was beginning to betray him. The persistent cough that had plagued him since his arrival worsened, his lungs heavy and his breath ragged. No matter how much he scrubbed, the dust clung to his skin, and he often found himself absent-mindedly scratching at patches of dry, irritated flesh. In the mirror, his reflection seemed wrong somehow, his eyes hollow, his movements sluggish. The whispers grew louder, slipping into his thoughts, suggesting things he couldn't bring himself to repeat. Rhea was no better. Caleb rarely saw her now, but when he did, she was a shadow of the woman who had greeted him upon his arrival. Her hands trembled and her voice had taken on a brittle edge. Once he caught her staring at her arm, where patches of skin had hardened into rough, crystalline scales. She tried to hide it, pulling her sleeve down quickly, but Caleb had already seen. "We're infected," he said quietly. She shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "It's just the environment, it's nothing." "It's not nothing," Caleb insisted, his voice rising. "It's the dust. It's the parasite. It's—" "Stop." Her tone was sharp, cutting him off. "Just stop." Caleb fell silent, watching as she turned and walked away. He wanted to follow her, to press her for answers, but something held him back. A nagging doubt that he was losing her, too. That night, he couldn't sleep. The whispers were deafening now, an unrelenting cacophony that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of his breathing. They spoke of surrender, of unity, of freedom in the storm. He paced his quarters, his mind racing. The red dust seemed thicker than ever, swirling faintly in the dim light like a living thing. He opened the air vent, and to his horror a fine trickle of the dust poured out, coating his hands. He stumbled back, his heart pounding, and the whispers laughed. The next day, Caleb found Rhea in the control room, staring at the monitors. The colony's systems were failing, air filters clogged, water supplies contaminated, power fluctuating. The parasite was spreading faster than either of them had anticipated, infiltrating every corner of their fragile outpost. "We can't stay here," Caleb said. "We need to evacuate." "To where?" Rhea snapped. "There's nowhere else. No one's coming to save us, Caleb. We're on our own." "Then we fight it," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "We destroy the growths, burn the colony if we have to. We can't just sit here and let it take us." But Rhea wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the storm raging outside, her expression distant. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice soft. "The dust. It's calling." "Rhea, I think I understand now," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "It's not trying to hurt us. It's trying to make us better." Caleb reached for her, but she pulled away, her eyes filled with something between fear and reverence. Before he could stop her, she turned and walked out of the room, heading toward the airlock. He chased after her, but by the time he reached the airlock, it was too late. She was already outside, her figure barely visible through the swirling storm. For a moment he thought she might come back, but then she disappeared, swallowed by the crimson haze. Caleb stood frozen, his chest heaving, the dust pressing against the airlock window like a living thing. He wanted to scream, to cry out, but the whispers drowned him out. That night, the colony's lights flickered and died, plunging Echelon 9 into darkness. The storm roared louder, and the whispers grew into a chorus, echoing through the metal halls. Caleb sat alone in his quarters, the red dust pooling around his feet, his lungs burning with every breath. The dust wasn't just in the air, it was inside him now, winding its way through his veins, remaking him from the inside out. He didn't know how much longer he could resist, or if he even wanted to. Outside, the storm called to him, promising release, promising peace, and deep down he knew it was only a matter of time. The colony was silent. Caleb stumbled through the corridors, his breathing labored and his vision blurred. The red dust was everywhere now, not just clinging to surfaces, but drifting through the air in delicate, swirling patterns. It filled the vents, choked the filters, and coated the walls like a second skin. The storm outside had become a constant rhythmic thrumming, as if the planet itself were alive, its pulse synchronizing with Caleb's own. He was the last one left. He hadn't seen another colonist in days, though he occasionally heard faint echoes, footsteps in distant halls, soft cries swallowed by the storm. Their quarters lay abandoned, personal belongings left in disarray, as if they had vanished mid-thought. Caleb's own reflection in the metal walls was a stranger's, his cheeks sunken, his eyes bloodshot, his skin marred by patches of hardened red scales. His hands trembled uncontrollably, the tips of his fingers numb, and he had stopped trying to scrub the dust away. It had become part of him now. He couldn't stop thinking about Rhea. She had gone into the storm willingly, her voice calm, her movements deliberate. Caleb had watched her disappear, and the image haunted him. Was she still out there, her body consumed and remade, or had she become something else entirely? He didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. The whispers were louder now, no longer a background hum, but a chorus, speaking in fragmented phrases that twisted through his mind. We are one. Let go. Become. The storm is life. Caleb shook his head violently, as if he could dislodge the voices, but they only grew more insistent, and the dust seemed to move with them, curling around his body like tendrils. He knew he didn't have much time left. His transformation had already begun. He could feel it in the way his joints ached, in the way his thoughts fractured and reassembled in alien patterns. His body was no longer his own, and soon neither would his mind be. Still, he clung to a shred of purpose. If the colony was doomed, he would at least make sure no one else suffered the same fate. He had identified the parasite's central hub, a massive underground chamber beneath the northern ridge, where the organism's tendrils converged into a pulsating, living mass. It was the source of the dust, the heart of the infection. If he could destroy it, perhaps he could stop the spread. Or perhaps it was just a futile gesture, a last gasp of resistance before succumbing to inevitability. Either way, it was all he had left. The explosives were heavy, their weight digging into his back as he made his way through the storm. The air outside was thick with dust, and his rebreather struggled to filter it out. Every breath felt like swallowing glass, his lungs raw and burning. The landscape was unrecognizable, jagged rocks blurred into swirling crimson, and the ground seemed to shift beneath his feet. He relied on his scanner to guide him, its flickering display barely functional. As he approached the ridge, the ground beneath him began to tremble, the vibrations resonating in his chest. The storm grew quieter, almost reverent, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. And then he saw it. The chamber. The opening yawned before him, a massive fissure in the earth. Inside, the pulsating growth stretched across the cavern, its tendrils snaking along the walls and ceiling like veins in a living organism. The core was enormous, a throbbing mass of translucent flesh that glowed faintly with an inner light. The dust emanated from it in great clouds, swirling and coalescing as if alive. Caleb felt a sickening pull toward it, as though the organism were calling him home. "You are part of us." The whispers filled his head, drowning out his thoughts. He stumbled forward, his hands trembling as he set the explosives around the chamber's perimeter. The organism seemed to react, its tendrils twitching and reaching toward him, but it made no effort to stop him. It didn't need to. Caleb could feel it inside him, rooting deeper with every passing moment. When the last charge was set, he stepped back and activated the timer. 10 minutes. It wasn't much time, but it was all he needed. He turned to leave, but his legs buckled, his body refusing to obey. The dust thickened, wrapping around him like a cocoon, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Stay, become, belong. Caleb fell to his knees, his vision swimming. His skin cracked and split, red crystalline scales spreading across his arms and chest. His fingers fused together, forming jagged claws, and his breath came in short, rasping gasps. He tried to hold on to himself, to his memories, but they slipped away, replaced by images that weren't his own. Vast networks of tendrils spreading across planets, consuming everything in their path, creating something new, something whole. The timer ticked down. 5 minutes. 4. Caleb reached for the detonator, his hand shaking. He could barely think now, his mind a haze of whispers and alien impulses. The organism pleaded with him, promising peace, unity, an end to the pain. For a moment he hesitated. It would be so easy to let go, to surrender to the dust. But then he remembered Rhea. He remembered the colonists who had vanished, their lives consumed by this thing. He remembered the dream of a new beginning, a chance to build something greater, stolen by the Red Storm. With the last shred of his humanity, he pressed the button. The explosion was deafening, the shock wave throwing him backward as fire and light consumed the chamber. The core screamed, not in sound, but in his mind, a piercing, agonized wail that shook the very ground. Caleb lay on the ground, his body broken, his vision fading. The storm outside faltered, the dust thinning, but he knew it wasn't over. The organism was too vast, too ingrained in the planet's very essence. He had bought time, nothing more. As the world faded to black, Caleb recorded one final message on his communicator, his voice weak but resolute. To anyone who finds this, leave. Leave before it's too late. Tartarus doesn't let you go. It doesn't kill you. It takes you, remakes you. If you stay, you'll become part of it. Just like I did. The recording ended, and Caleb's body dissolved into the dust, his final breath carried away by the storm. Above, the crimson sky loomed vast and endless as the whispers began again, soft and unrelenting. The dust is life. The dust is will. The dust is forever.